In the autumn of 1872, a clerk at the Beaufort County Courthouse in South Carolina discovered something that should not have existed. His name was Amos Bell, a man of 53 years who had spent 3 decades organizing property records, marriage certificates, and estate inventories in the basement archive of the courthouse. He knew every ledger in that room by the color of its binding, by the warping of its spine, by the particular smell of the ink used in each decade. So when his fingers brushed against a loose sheet of paper tucked inside a water-damaged property registry from the 1850s, he knew immediately that it did not belong there. The paper was yellowed but intact, folded into quarters, with a precision that suggested it had been hidden deliberately rather than misplaced. Amos carried it to the reading table beneath the single window, where the October light fell pale and thin across the wood. He unfolded it carefully, expecting perhaps a forgotten deed or a boundary survey that had been misfiled during the chaos of the war years, when records were moved twice to protect them from Sherman's advancing columns. What he found was a bill of sale. The document was dated March 12, 1851. It recorded the transfer of an infant child, identified as Elijah, son of Ruth Carter, for the sum of $1. The seller was listed as Augustus Weller, owner of a rice plantation along the Combahee River known as Bellwether. The buyer was a physician named Nathaniel Harrow, a man who, according to every available record, owned no land, held no slaves, and had no known commercial connection to the Weller family. Amos turned the paper over. The reverse side was blank. He read the document again. Certain he had misunderstood. $1. $1. In 1851, a healthy infant of any race would have been valued at 100 times that amount, and the sale of a child of mixed ancestry, which the name Elijah suggested, would have been handled through private arrangement rather than formal documentation. There was no legal purpose for such a transaction, no tax advantage, no inheritance strategy that could explain why Augustus Weller, one of the wealthiest planters in the Low Country, would sell a baby to a country doctor for the price of a pound of coffee. Amos set the paper down on the table and did not touch it again for nearly an hour. He was not a superstitious man, but he had worked in that basement long enough to recognize when a document was trying to tell him something that someone else had wanted to remain buried. He did not file the paper. Instead, he folded it back into quarters and placed it inside his coat pocket. On his way home that evening, he stopped at the office of the county magistrate and asked whether anyone had ever come looking for records related to a child named Elijah Carter. No one had. The matter might have ended there, another loose thread in a county whose history was stitched together from loose threads, had it not been for the young man who walked into the courthouse on the morning of October 29th, 1872. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in the plain wool coat of a tradesman. His skin was the color of aged oak, and his hair was cut short and neat. He approached the front desk and spoke with the quiet formality of someone who had been raised to show deference, even when asking for what belonged to him. He gave his name as Elias Harrow and explained that he had traveled from a coastal community north of Charleston, a place called McClellanville, where he had lived his entire 21 years. He was looking for a record, he said, a bill of sale dated March of 1851, involving an infant named Elijah and a woman called Ruth Carter. He carried a letter, which he offered to show, that suggested his true name might not be Elias Harrow at all. The clerk on duty, a young man named Thomas Finch, listened with growing unease, and then sent word to Amos Bell in the basement. Amos climbed the stairs slowly, his hand resting against the paper still folded inside his coat, and when he reached the top and saw the young man waiting in the hall, he stopped. Thomas Finch would later tell his wife that he had never seen Amos Bell look frightened before. But at that moment, the old clerk's face went slack, and his right hand rose unbidden to his chest. The young man had not yet removed his hat. When he did, Amos understood why. Hanging in the main courtroom of the Beaufort County Courthouse, gathering dust above the judge's bench, was a portrait of Julian Weller. It had been commissioned in 1849, when Julian was 25 years old and still the presumed heir to Bellwether, 2 years before his death. The portrait had been paid for by his father and hung in the great hall of the plantation house until the war, when Margaret Weller Ashford, Julian's sister, had donated it to the county along with a small endowment for its perpetual display. She had described it as a memorial to her beloved brother, taken too soon by illness. The young man standing before Amos Bell had Julian Weller's face, not a resemblance, not a family echo. The same face, the same high forehead and narrow bridge of the nose, the same set of the jaw and angle of the cheekbones, the same distinct and unmistakable feature that anyone who had studied the portrait would recognize: a small irregularity in the left ear, a slight folding of the cartilage at the upper rim that gave the ear an asymmetrical shape, as though it had been pressed inward by a thumb. Elias Harrow had that same ear. He had been born with it. Amos Bell did not speak for what felt to him like a very long time. Then he reached into his coat, removed the folded paper, and said something that made Thomas Finch lean forward to be certain he had heard correctly. "I believe this belongs to you." The story that unfolded over the following weeks and months would be reconstructed from court records, private correspondence, municipal archives, and the fragmentary recollections of those who had lived in the Low Country long enough to remember the years before the war. It was a story that many in Beaufort County had taken great pains to forget, and one that a smaller number had taken even greater pains to conceal. In the spring of 1851, Bellwether was one of the largest rice plantations along the Combahee River, encompassing nearly 2,000 acres of tidal fields, cypress swamps, and elevated ground, where the main house stood among a grove of live oaks draped in Spanish moss. Augustus Weller had inherited the property from his father in 1827, at the age of 31, and had expanded it through a combination of strategic marriages, territorial purchases, and the uncompromising management of an enslaved workforce that numbered close to 200 people by the 1840s. His wife, Eleanor, had died in 1839, leaving him with 2 children, Julian, who was 11 at the time, and Margaret, who was 7. Augustus never remarried. He devoted himself instead to the plantation and to the cultivation of his son as heir, a project that Julian, by all surviving accounts, resisted in ways both subtle and overt. Julian was described in letters written by family acquaintances as intelligent but melancholic, prone to long silences and sudden withdrawals from social occasions. He had studied for a year at the College of Charleston before returning to Bellwether, not out of academic failure, but because, according to one cousin, he could not bear to be away from the river. What that meant exactly, no one seems to have asked. At the age of 24, Julian assumed partial management of the plantation's accounts, a responsibility that brought him into regular contact with every aspect of the property's operations, including the enslaved community that lived in a row of cabins set back from the main fields, shielded from the house by a dense stand of water oaks. It was there, in early 1850, that Julian Weller met Ruth Carter. Ruth was 23 years old that spring. She had been born on Bellwether, the daughter of a field hand named Moses Carter and a seamstress named Delia, both of whom had died of cholera during the outbreak of 1841. Ruth had been trained by her mother in needlework and had been assigned to the household sewing room at the age of 14, where she mended linens, altered dresses, and embroidered the monograms that appeared on every napkin and pillowcase in the main house. The assignment was considered a privilege among the enslaved community, a position that kept her out of the rice fields and close to the relative comfort of the house, but it also placed her in near constant proximity to the Weller family. Precisely when the relationship between Julian Weller and Ruth Carter began, and what form it took, cannot be established with certainty. The surviving records are deliberately ambiguous. Sarah Pritchard, who worked as a household servant at Bellwether from 1848 until the plantation was sold in 1866, would later testify that Julian showed kindness to Ruth that went beyond common decency. She described seeing them speak together in the sewing room after the rest of the household had retired, and she recalled at least one occasion when Julian had personally intervened to prevent an overseer from disciplining Ruth for an infraction that would normally have resulted in a whipping. Other accounts are less charitable. Margaret Weller Ashford, in a letter written to her cousin in 1873, described Ruth as a woman of cunning who knew how to exploit my brother's weakness of character. The letter, which survives in the archives of the South Carolina Historical Society, does not elaborate on what that weakness might have been, but the choice of words is itself revealing. Margaret did not deny the relationship. She blamed the woman. In the autumn of 1850, Ruth Carter gave birth to a son. The child was born in one of the cabins behind the water oaks, attended by a midwife named Esther, who had delivered most of the children on Bellwether for the past 20 years. According to Sarah Pritchard, Julian visited the cabin the following morning after the household had been told that Ruth was ill and would be unable to perform her duties. He remained inside for nearly an hour. The baby was given the name Elijah after Ruth's father. The name was not registered in any church log, not because the baptism did not occur, but because the church records from that period contain a conspicuous gap, a span of 6 months in late 1850 and early 1851, during which the baptismal register for the parish of St. Helena shows no entries at all. The pages are present, but they are blank. The reason for this gap would become apparent only 21 years later, when Amos Bell compared the handwriting in the bill of sale with the handwriting in the church register. They matched. The same hand that had recorded the transfer of Elijah for $1 had also supervised the parish records during the months when Elijah's birth and baptism should have been documented. That hand belonged to Augustus Weller, who served as a vestryman of St. Helena's Church from 1847 until his death in 1859. In the months following Elijah's birth, something changed at Bellwether. The plantation's account book, which Amos Bell eventually located in a storage trunk in the courthouse basement, contained a series of entries that, taken together, painted a picture that no one had been meant to see. Beginning in December of 1850, Ruth Carter began receiving small payments, authorized not by Augustus but by Julian. The amounts were modest, $2 here, $3 there, always entered under the category of household sundries, a vague designation that the plantation's bookkeeper had used for decades to cover expenses that required no explanation. In a typical year, the household sundries account might record payments for lamp oil, sewing thread, or the services of a traveling knife sharpener. Payments to a seamstress who was already enslaved on the property made no sense at all. The payments continued through January, February, and into early March of 1851. On March 5th, they stopped. On March 12th, the bill of sale was signed. But the account book contained a second entry, one that Amos Bell nearly missed because it had been deliberately obscured. Someone had poured ink across a line in the March section of the ledger, creating a black stain that had dried into a crusted patch. When Amos held the page beneath an angled lamp, a technique he had learned from a circuit judge who had served during the war, the underlying text became legible. It recorded a payment of $200 to Dr. Nathaniel Harrow for services of discretion and transport. $200. For comparison, an entire acre of improved rice land in the Beaufort district sold for approximately $40 in 1851. Augustus Weller had paid the doctor the equivalent of 5 acres of prime farmland to take a baby away and keep quiet about it. The question that remained, and the question that Elias Harrow had traveled to Beaufort to answer, was where his mother had gone. Ruth Carter disappeared from Bellwether's records on the same day that her son did. The plantation's account book contained no further mention of her, and the quarterly inventory of enslaved persons, which Augustus Weller was required to submit to the county tax assessor, showed one fewer seamstress in the household, beginning in April of 1851. No record of a sale was ever filed. Elias had been raised in McClellanville, a fishing village set among the tidal creeks and salt marshes north of Charleston, in a modest 2-story house on Pinckney Street that belonged to Dr. Nathaniel Harrow and his wife Clara. The Harrows had no children of their own, and according to Elias, had treated him with the same affection and care that any parents would give a son. He had attended the village school, learned to read and write, and been trained in his adoptive father's profession, assisting with patients and mixing medicines in the small apothecary that occupied the ground floor of their home. Dr. Harrow died in March of 1871 at the age of 68, from what the attending physician described as a sudden and violent congestion of the lungs. Clara Harrow had died 6 years earlier, in 1865, during an outbreak of yellow fever that swept through the Low Country in the final months of the war. After the funeral, Elias began sorting through his father's belongings, a task that fell to him as the sole surviving member of the Harrow household. The house on Pinckney Street was cluttered with the accumulated possessions of a country doctor's lifetime. Medical textbooks, patient ledgers, glass vials, surgical instruments wrapped in oilcloth, correspondence with physicians in Charleston and Savannah, and boxes of receipts tied with twine and stacked in the attic. It was in the attic, inside a cedar chest that had been pushed against the far wall and covered with a layer of quilts that smelled of camphor, that Elias found the box. It was small, no larger than a man's hand, made of polished rosewood with brass hinges and a brass clasp that had been sealed with a dollop of red wax. The wax bore the impression of a seal, but the design had been smeared before it hardened, rendering it indecipherable. Tucked beneath the box was an envelope, unsealed, with Elias's name written across the front in his father's handwriting. The letter inside was brief. It began without salutation and ended without signature, as though Nathaniel Harrow had written it in haste or in fear, or perhaps in the knowledge that no words could soften what it had to say. "If you are reading this," the letter began, "I am gone, and the silence I have kept for 20 years belongs now to you." The child named Elijah, son of Ruth Carter, was taken from Bellwether Plantation in March of 1851 and brought to this house. That child is you. Augustus Weller paid me to remove you and paid again to ensure I never spoke of what I had done. I was told the mother would follow. She never did. The box contains a medal given to me by Julian Weller, who asked that it be kept for his son. I do not know what became of him. I do not know what became of her. I am sorry. Inside the rosewood box, resting on a small cushion of faded velvet, was a silver medal. It was oval, approximately 2 inches in height, suspended from a length of tarnished chain. Engraved on one side were the initials J.W., surrounded by an ornate border of leaves and vines. The other side was blank, except for a date, March 12th, 1851, the date of the sale. Elias sat in the attic of the house on Pinckney Street for what he later estimated to be 4 hours, holding the medal in his palm, reading and rereading his father's letter until the words blurred together. He had been raised to believe that he was an orphan, the child of unnamed parents who had died during an epidemic in the early 1850s. He had never questioned this account, and the Harrows had never offered any details that might prompt questions. Now he understood why. In the weeks that followed, Elias gathered what information he could. He visited the Public Records Office in Charleston and searched for any mention of Bellwether Plantation or the Weller family. He found the property in the tax rolls, identified the surviving heir as Margaret Weller Ashford, and learned that she still resided in Beaufort County, in a house on Bay Street that had been purchased with the proceeds from the post-war sale of most of Bellwether's acreage. He also searched for Ruth Carter. The name appeared nowhere in the Emancipation Records of 1865, the Freedmen's Bureau documents, or the marriage registers of St. Helena's Parish. It was as though she had never existed, or as though someone had systematically removed every trace of her from the public record. The letter suggested that Elias's true name might be Elijah Carter, but without his mother, without any surviving relative who could confirm his identity. The name was only a word, a ghost of a life he had never been allowed to live. And so, in late October of 1872, Elias Harrow boarded a train in Charleston and travelled south to Beaufort, carrying a letter, a silver medal, and a question that no one in the county seemed prepared to answer. The first person to provide any substantive account was Sarah Pritchard. By 1872, Sarah was 68 years old and living in a small house on the outskirts of Beaufort, supported by a pension from Margaret Weller Ashford, who had kept her on as a domestic servant after the war. The pension was modest, enough to cover food and firewood, and it came with an unspoken condition. Sarah did not discuss the Weller family with outsiders. When Amos Bell approached her, accompanied by Elias Harrow, she initially refused to speak. She stood in the doorway of her house with her arms crossed, her face set in an expression of studied neutrality, and said only that she had been a loyal servant to the Weller family for nearly 20 years and had no wish to betray their confidence. Elias did not argue. He simply removed his hat and stood in the sunlight that fell through the branches of a water oak in Sarah's front yard. And he waited. Sarah looked at his face for a long time. Then she stepped back from the doorway and motioned for them to come inside. What she told them over the course of that afternoon, and in several subsequent conversations, would form the core of the investigation that Amos Bell now pursued with the quiet intensity of a man who had spent his life among documents and had finally found one that mattered. According to Sarah, Julian Weller had fallen in love with Ruth Carter, or as close to love as the circumstances of that time and place would permit. He had spoken of freeing her, of sending her north to a city where she could live as a free woman, and of providing for the child she had borne him. In the months before Elijah's birth, Julian had consulted a lawyer in Charleston, a man named Phineas Cross, whose name would later appear in Amos Bell's investigation, and had begun drafting documents to that effect. Augustus Weller learned of these plans in late February of 1851. The source of his information was never established. Sarah suspected it was the lawyer himself, who may have felt a professional obligation to inform the head of the family that his son was preparing to acknowledge an enslaved woman and her child as his legal heirs. Others, including Margaret in her later years, suggested that a household servant had overheard Julian and Ruth speaking and had reported the conversation to Augustus out of fear of the consequences if she did not. Whatever the source, the result was the same. On the evening of February 28th, Augustus summoned Julian to his study and closed the door. The argument that followed lasted, by Sarah's reckoning, well past midnight. She could not hear the words, but she could hear the voices. Augustus's low and controlled, Julian's rising and falling in a cadence of desperation that she had never heard from him before. The following morning, Julian did not appear at breakfast. He did not appear at lunch. When Sarah asked Margaret where her brother was, Margaret replied only that he was unwell and was not to be disturbed. Julian remained confined to his rooms for the next 3 months. During that time, the only person permitted to visit him, apart from his father and sister, was Dr. Nathaniel Harrow, who arrived at Bellwether once a week in a carriage that came by a circuitous route and left by a different one, as though its presence needed to be explained away. The official story, circulated by Augustus and repeated by Margaret for the next 2 decades, was that Julian was suffering from a nervous disorder brought on by overwork and was receiving medical treatment in the seclusion of his own home. No hospital records exist to support this claim. No physician other than Harrow was ever consulted, and Harrow's name appears in no medical registry or professional directory for the state of South Carolina during that period. Sarah believed, though she could not prove, that Julian had been drugged. She noted that the food sent to his room was often returned untouched, and that on the occasions when she managed to glimpse him through a half-open door, his eyes were unfocused, his speech was slurred, and he seemed unable to stand without assistance. The baby, meanwhile, had been taken from Ruth. Sarah did not witness the taking. What she witnessed was the silence that followed it, the empty cabin behind the water oaks, the sewing room where Ruth's chair sat unused, the questions that no one dared to ask, and the answers that no one was willing to give. Ruth herself had not been seen at Bellwether since the night of March 11th. When Sarah asked the overseer what had become of her, he replied that she had been sold to a plantation in Georgia and that it was not Sarah's place to ask such questions. Elias Harrow listened to this account without interruption, his hands resting motionless on his knees, his eyes fixed on the floor. When Sarah finished, he asked a single question. Had Ruth known where her son was being taken? Sarah did not answer immediately. She rose from her chair, crossed to a small bureau in the corner of the room, and withdrew a folded piece of cloth from the top drawer. Inside was a scrap of paper, torn from the edge of a larger sheet and covered in handwriting that Sarah identified as Julian's. The note read, "She believes he is with you. She believes you will keep him safe until she can come. Do not tell her otherwise." It was not addressed to anyone. It had no date, but Sarah was certain it had been written by Julian during his confinement and smuggled out of the house, perhaps with the doctor, in the hope that someone would deliver it to Ruth. Sarah did not know whether Ruth had ever received the message. What she did know, because she had been told by Margaret years later, during an argument that Sarah had never been permitted to discuss, was that Ruth had not been sold to Georgia. Augustus Weller had lied. The sale that had been recorded, the transfer to a distant plantation that would have removed Ruth from the county and from any possibility of reclaiming her son, had never occurred. Instead, Ruth had been taken to a property on the western edge of the county, a parcel of scrubland and second-growth pine that Augustus owned through a proxy and used for purposes he did not wish to document. Sarah did not know precisely what had happened to Ruth there. What she knew was that, in early 1852, nearly a year after Elijah had been taken, a woman matching Ruth's description had appeared at Bellwether. She had walked from the western edge of the county, a distance of 12 miles, and had arrived at the plantation gate after nightfall. She was thin, visibly ill, and demanding to see Julian Weller. She was turned away at the gate. The overseer who turned her away told her, on Augustus's orders, that Julian was dead and that her son had died with him. Neither statement was true. Julian was still alive, confined to his rooms, his condition deteriorating. Elijah was alive and healthy in McClellanville, being raised by Nathaniel and Clara Harrow under a false name. But Ruth did not know this. She had walked 12 miles on the word of a note that had never reached her, and the answer she received was that she had lost everything. Sarah had not seen Ruth after that night. She did not know where she had gone, or whether she had survived the walk back across the county, or whether she had been intercepted on the road and returned to the property from which she had escaped. She knew only that Ruth Carter had never appeared in any public record after 1852, and that the small, unnamed gravestone that now stood beside Julian Weller's tomb in the family cemetery had been placed there, according to Margaret, for a servant who had died of fever in 1866. Sarah did not believe it was a servant. She had worked at Bellwether in 1866, and she remembered no fever that summer. As Elias prepared to leave Sarah Pritchard's house, she reached out and touched his arm. Her hand was thin and dry, the knuckles swollen with age, but her grip was firm. "You have his face," she said, "Julian's face, but you have her eyes, Ruth's eyes. I remember them. Brown, almost black, like river water in the shade. I remember." Elias did not speak. He placed his hand over hers for a moment, and then he walked out into the October afternoon, carrying the weight of everything she had told him. Amos Bell did not sleep for 3 nights after his conversation with Sarah Pritchard. He had worked at the courthouse for 31 years, and in all that time he had never encountered a document that demanded so urgently to be understood. The bill of sale, the obscured ledger entries, the blank pages in the baptismal register, the note written in Julian Weller's hand, the woman who had walked 12 miles to be told that her son was dead. These were not random fragments. They were pieces of a pattern, and the pattern was becoming clear. On the morning of November 3rd, Amos returned to the courthouse basement before sunrise. He lit the oil lamp that hung from a hook above the reading table and began a systematic search of the estate records for the year 1851. His objective was simple: to find every document that mentioned Julian Weller, Nathaniel Harrow, or Ruth Carter, and to trace the connections between them. The search took most of the day. The courthouse archives had been disorganized by the war, when a retreating Confederate unit had used the basement as a temporary storage depot and had rearranged the shelves to make room for crates of ammunition and medical supplies. Entire years of records had been shifted, stacked, and in some cases removed to private homes for safekeeping, never to be returned. Amos had spent the better part of a decade restoring order to the collection, but gaps remained, and the 1850s were among the worst affected. He began with the probate files. Julian Weller had died in late June of 1851, 3 months after the bill of sale. His estate, modest by the standards of the Weller family, consisted of a small bank account in Charleston, a collection of books, a wardrobe of clothing, and a horse that had been sold to a neighbor shortly before his death. No mention of any child, no mention of Ruth Carter. The inventory had been filed by Augustus Weller and approved by a judge named Hiram Bledsoe, who had died in 1863 and whose personal papers, Amos knew, had been donated to the courthouse by his widow. It was in Bledsoe's papers, stored in a trunk in the farthest corner of the basement, that Amos found the first of what he would later describe in his notes as the missing pieces. The trunk contained, among other things, a leather portfolio that had belonged to Phineas Cross, the Charleston lawyer whom Sarah Pritchard had mentioned. Cross had died in 1859, intestate and without heirs, and his professional papers had been transferred to Judge Bledsoe for reasons that the surviving correspondence did not fully explain. The portfolio contained drafts of legal documents, correspondence with clients, and a small number of completed wills that had been filed with the court. At the bottom of the portfolio, folded inside a sheet of blank paper, was a copy of a will. It was not the original. The original, Amos knew, had either been destroyed or filed away in some archive that he had not yet located, but the copy was complete enough to be legible, and what it contained confirmed everything that Sarah Pritchard had said and more. The will was dated June 18th, 1851. It had been drafted by Phineas Cross at the request of Julian Weller, who was identified in the opening paragraph as being of sound mind and memory, though confined at present to his residence at Bellwether Plantation. The document began with the standard provisions: the disposition of personal effects, the settlement of debts, and then arrived at a section that Amos read 3 times to be certain he had not misunderstood. I give, devise and bequeath to my natural son Elijah, born of Ruth Carter, the following. First, a parcel of land consisting of approximately 200 acres situated at the western boundary of Bellwether Plantation, bounded on the north by the public road to Coosawhatchie and on the south by the Combahee River. Second, the sum of $5,000 to be held in trust by Phineas Cross, Esquire, until such time as the said Elijah shall reach legal adulthood. Third, a silver medal engraved with my initials, which has been placed in the keeping of Dr. Nathaniel Harrow as a token of my paternal recognition. Fourth, such books, papers, and personal effects as may be selected by the said Elijah from my private library and study. The will went on to direct that Ruth Carter be freed immediately and provided with the means to travel to any free state of her choosing, with an annual allowance of $200 to be paid from the estate. Julian had signed the document, or at least a version of it existed with his signature at the bottom, but the copy in Amos's hands was incomplete. The final page, which should have contained the signatures of witnesses and the notary's seal, had been torn away. The tier was horizontal, roughly parallel to the edge of the page, and it had been made with a sharp instrument, a letter opener perhaps, or a knife, rather than torn by hand. Amos set the will down on the table and pressed his palms flat against the wood to steady them. The document before him was not merely evidence of a hidden inheritance. It was a motive. Julian Weller had intended to provide for his son and for the woman who had borne that son. He had intended to acknowledge them in a legal document that would have been filed with the court, read into the public record, and preserved for posterity. And someone had torn the final page from that document, rendering it invalid, and had then ensured that no one ever came looking for the missing piece. That someone, Amos was certain, was Augustus Weller. The evidence was circumstantial, but overwhelming. Augustus stood to lose a significant portion of Bellwether if Julian's will was executed. 200 acres and $5,000 was not a trivial bequest. It represented roughly 1/10 of the plantation's total acreage, and a sum of money that would have strained the family's liquid resources. More importantly, the acknowledgement of Elijah as Julian's natural son would have been a public humiliation, a stain on the family's reputation that no amount of money could erase. Augustus had the means to destroy the will. He had access to every room in Bellwether, including Julian's study, where the document would have been kept. He had a relationship with Phineas Cross, whom he had undoubtedly pressured to surrender his copy, and he had a motive powerful enough to justify, in his own mind at least, actions that might otherwise have been unthinkable. The question that remained was how far he had been willing to go. Amos turned next to the church records of St. Helena's Parish. The burial register for June of 1851 contained an entry for Julian Weller, dated June 23rd. The entry was brief. Julian Weller, aged 27 years, son of Augustus Weller, interred in the family plot at Bellwether. But there were 2 details that caught Amos's attention. The first was the time of burial. 10 o'clock at night. In the Low Country in June, the heat and humidity made nighttime burials almost unheard of, unless there was a specific reason to avoid the daylight. The second detail was the absence of any reference to a funeral service, a eulogy, or the presence of a minister. Julian had been placed in the ground in darkness, without ceremony, without public acknowledgement, as though his death were a thing to be disposed of rather than mourned. 2 days after Julian's burial, on June 25th, Augustus Weller made a payment of $250 to Phineas Cross. The payment was recorded in the plantation ledger under the heading Legal Services, a designation vague enough to cover anything from a property dispute to a criminal defense. Amos suspected it was neither. The payment was made, in his judgment, to purchase Cross's silence and the return of every document in his possession related to Julian Weller. Elias Harrow was staying in a boarding house on Craven Street, a narrow road that ran parallel to the waterfront, lined with wooden buildings that creaked in the wind and smelled of salt and mud. The room was small, furnished with a bed, a washstand, and a chair that listed to the left, and Elias spent most of his waking hours not in the room but in the courthouse, where Amos Bell had granted him access to the archive and a corner of the reading room where he could review documents in private. It was there, on the afternoon of November 5th, that Elias first laid eyes on the portrait of Julian Weller. The painting had hung above the judge's bench in the main courtroom for as long as anyone could remember, a gift from the Weller family that had been accepted by the county with gratitude and displayed with pride. It showed Julian at the age of 25, 2 years before his death, dressed in a dark coat and white cravat, seated in a wooden chair, with his right hand resting on a book and his left hand on the arm of the chair. His expression was calm but not relaxed, the faint suggestion of a smile at the corners of his mouth that gave the portrait an unsettling quality, as though Julian had known something that the painter did not. Elias stood before the portrait for a long time. The similarity was unmistakable, but it was more than that. The portrait did not merely resemble him. It anticipated him. The angle of the head, the set of the shoulders, the slight asymmetry of the left ear. These were not family characteristics passed down through generations. They were the specific, idiosyncratic features of a man whose face had been reproduced in his son with an accuracy that seemed almost deliberate, as though biology had refused to let the resemblance be denied. Amos found him there an hour later, still standing before the portrait, still holding his hat in his hands. "I have something to show you," Amos said. He led Elias back to the basement and placed the copy of Julian's will on the reading table. Elias read it in silence, his lips moving slightly as he worked through the legal language, his brow furrowed in concentration. When he reached the passage that named him as Julian's natural son, he stopped. He read the words again. Then he set the paper down and looked at Amos with an expression that was not surprise or sorrow or anger, but something closer to exhaustion, the exhaustion of a man who had been carrying a weight for so long that he no longer remembered what it felt like to be free of it. "My father knew," Elias said. "He meant Nathaniel Harrow. He knew who I was, and he never told me. He may have believed he was protecting you. From what?" Amos did not answer. The answer, when it came, would be found not in the basement of the courthouse, but in the house on Bay Street, where Margaret Weller Ashford had lived for the past 6 years, and where she now sat in a parlour filled with the furniture of a plantation that no longer existed, surrounded by the portraits of a family that had dwindled to a single branch. Margaret Weller Ashford was 70 years old in the autumn of 1872. She had married a man named Charles Ashford in 1854, a planter from a respectable but declining family who had died of typhoid in 1861, leaving her with no children and a fraction of the wealth she had expected to inherit. The war had taken the rest. Sherman's troops had not reached Bellwether. The plantation lay south of the main route of the march to the sea. But the collapse of the Confederacy had destroyed the economic foundation on which the Weller fortune had been built. Rice required labor, and labor was no longer free. By 1866, Margaret had sold 2/3 of Bellwether's acreage to pay off debts and had retired to Bay Street, where she lived on the remaining proceeds in a house that was comfortable but not grand. a far cry from the plantation manor where she had been raised. She received Amos Bell in the parlor, seated in a high-backed chair with a cane resting across her knees. Her white hair pulled back in a severe bun, her eyes sharp and unreceptive. She did not offer him tea. Amos had not come alone. Elias waited outside on the porch at Amos's instruction. The old clerk had judged correctly that Margaret would be more likely to speak if she did not have to face the living evidence of what her family had done. "I understand you've been asking questions about my brother," Margaret said. "I was told that a young man came to the courthouse claiming to resemble Julian. I hope you haven't been encouraging this." "Margaret," Amos said, using her first name with the familiarity of a man who had known the Weller family for 30 years, "I found a copy of your brother's will." The cane in Margaret's lap shifted slightly. Her expression did not change, but her right hand tightened around the handle, the knuckles whitening. "There was no will," she said. "Julian died intestate. His estate was administered by my father. Everything was handled properly. The will was drafted by Phineas Cross on June 18th, 1851, 5 days before your brother died. It names Elijah, the son of Ruth Carter, as Julian's natural son and heir. It bequeaths 200 acres and $5,000 to the child. It provides for Ruth's freedom and her relocation to a free state." Margaret was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but not trembling. Phineas Cross was a drunkard. He was disbarred in 1858 for misappropriating client funds. Anything he drafted would have been unreliable. His disbarment occurred 7 years after this will was written, and the will matches every other piece of evidence I've found. The payments to Ruth Carter, authorized by Julian, the payment to Dr. Harrow, the bill of sale for $1, the missing pages in the baptismal register. Your brother acknowledged the child. He intended to provide for him, and someone made sure that never happened. You know nothing about what happened. Then tell me." Margaret did not speak for nearly a minute. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked 12 times, marking the noon hour, and the sound filled the room like the footsteps of someone descending a staircase. "I was 29 years old," she said finally. "Old enough to understand, not old enough to object. My father was a hard man, but he was not a monster. He was trying to preserve our family. Julian was not well. He had been unstable for years. His attachment to that woman, it was a symptom of his illness, not a genuine sentiment. He did not know what he was doing. He knew enough to draft a will. He was confined to his room for 3 months. He was not in his right mind. The will would never have held up in court. Our father was merely ensuring that the estate was not entangled in a legal dispute that would have ruined us." "And the baby?" Margaret's jaw tightened. "The baby was given to a good family. Dr. Harrow and his wife were decent people. They raised the boy. He received an education. He was not abandoned. He was sold. $1 is not a sale. It is a symbol, a legal formality. It was the only way to sever the legal connection between the child and the plantation without drawing attention to the transaction." "You destroyed your brother's letters." Margaret flinched. The word cut through her composure like a blade through fabric, and for a moment the practiced dignity of the plantation mistress gave way to something older and rawer. "I burned the letters," she said. "All of them except one. I could not bring myself to burn them all." She rose from the chair, leaning heavily on her cane, and crossed the room to a writing desk that stood against the far wall. She unlocked a drawer, removed a small stack of papers tied with a faded ribbon, and handed the bundle to Amos. "These were written during his confinement. He gave them to me and asked me to deliver them to the lawyer. I did not. I showed them to our father instead. I have regretted that decision every day for 21 years. Amos untied the ribbon. There were 6 letters in total, each written in the same hand that had appeared in the plantation ledger and on the note that Sarah Pritchard had preserved. The letters were addressed to Phineas Cross, to Ruth Carter, to Nathaniel Harrow, and to a 4th recipient whom Amos did not recognize, a woman in Philadelphia named Abigail Thornton, identified in the letter as a cousin of Ruth's, who had escaped slavery a decade earlier and was living as a free woman. The letters detailed Julian's plan with a clarity that made Margaret's claim of mental instability difficult to sustain. He had intended to free Ruth through legal manumission, which required an act of the South Carolina legislature, but which Julian believed he could secure through a combination of political connections and financial incentives. He had intended to send Ruth and Elijah to Philadelphia, where Abigail Thornton had agreed to receive them and help them establish themselves. He had intended to travel north himself as soon as his affairs in South Carolina were settled, and to live with them openly, as a family. "My father could not allow it," Margaret said. She had returned to her chair and sat with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the window. Not the money. The money was nothing. It was the acknowledgement. A Weller could not openly claim an enslaved woman's child as his heir. It would have destroyed our social position. It would have made Julian a pariah. Every planter in the district would have turned against us. Instead, you destroyed a family. We preserved a legacy. Or so my father believed. He died in 1859. The war came 6 years later. The legacy he preserved was sold off piece by piece to pay taxes and settle debts. Bellwether is gone, Mr. Bell. The great house is a ruin. The fields are overgrown. The last of the land was sold 2 years ago to a timber company from New York. All of that sacrifice, all of that cruelty, and for what? Amos did not answer. He was reading the final letter in the bundle, the one addressed to Ruth Carter. It was dated June 20th, 1851, 3 days before Julian's death. "My dearest Ruth," the letter began, "I have been told that Elijah is with Dr. Harrow and his wife in McClellanville. They are good people. They will care for him until you arrive. I have arranged for your passage to Philadelphia through a contact in Charleston. You will travel by ship to Baltimore and then by rail to your cousin Abigail's home. I will follow as soon as I am able. Do not return to Bellwether. Do not attempt to see me. My father is watching and he will stop at nothing to prevent this. Trust no one except Dr. Harrow. He will tell you where to go and when. I am sorry that I cannot be with you. I'm sorry for everything. I love you. I love our son. I will find you." The letter had never been delivered. Ruth had never gone to Philadelphia. She had never been reunited with her son, never learned that Julian had intended to join them, never known that she had been loved, at least in the way that Julian Weller understood love, by the father of her child. She had been taken to a remote property on the western edge of the county, held there for nearly a year, and then turned away at the gate of Bellwether with a lie that had destroyed whatever hope she had left. Amos folded the letter and placed it back in the bundle. Margaret was crying now, silently, the tears tracking through the powder on her cheeks and dripping onto the collar of her dress. "The young man," she said, "the one who came to the courthouse. Is he here?" "He's on the porch. But I should like to see him." Amos hesitated. The request, coming after everything Margaret had admitted, felt like a trap, a final manipulation in a story built on manipulations. But Elias had a right to face the woman who had destroyed his mother's letters, and Amos could not deny him that. He opened the door and stepped onto the porch. Elias was standing at the railing, looking out across the street toward the bay, his silhouette sharp against the grey October sky. He turned when Amos appeared. "Mrs. Ashford would like to speak with you." Elias did not respond immediately. He looked at the door, then at Amos, then back at the door, as though measuring the distance in more than feet. Then he straightened his coat, adjusted his collar, and walked inside. Margaret did not rise when he entered. She sat motionless in her chair, her hands gripping the cane, her eyes moving across his face with an intensity that bordered on hunger. She looked at his forehead, his cheekbones, his jaw, and finally his left ear, the one with the folded cartilage, the same irregularity that had appeared in Julian's portrait and that Margaret had seen every day of her childhood. "It is true," she said. "You have his face." "I was told that I have my mother's eyes," Elias replied. His voice was steady, but Amos could hear the effort behind it, the discipline of a man who had been taught from childhood to hide his emotions and was now testing the limits of that teaching. Margaret did not answer. She reached into the pocket of her dress and withdrew a small object which she held out toward Elias. It was a photograph, a daguerreotype, framed in tarnished silver, showing a young woman seated in a wooden chair with her hands folded in her lap. She was wearing a plain dress, her hair pulled back from her face, her expression serious but not fearful. Her eyes, dark and direct, stared into the camera with a steadiness that suggested she was not accustomed to being looked at and had decided in that moment to look back. "That is Ruth Carter," Margaret said. "It was taken in 1850 before you were born. Julian commissioned it. He kept it in his study, hidden behind a book. And when he was confined, I found it. I did not tell my father. I could not bring myself to destroy it any more than I could destroy the letters. I have kept it for 22 years. Elias took the photograph. His hands, which had been steady throughout the conversation, trembled slightly as he held it. He looked at the face of his mother, the first image of her he had ever seen, and for a long time no one in the room spoke. "She walked 12 miles to find me," Elias said finally, "and you told her I was dead. My father told her I did not know. I was not there. You knew afterward. You knew, and you did nothing." Margaret closed her eyes. The tears had stopped, but her face was grey now, the colour of old ash, and when she spoke, her voice was barely audible. "I have done nothing my entire life. That is the truth of it. I watched my father destroy my brother. I watched a child be taken from his mother. I watched Ruth disappear, and Julian die, and the plantation crumble. And through all of it, I did nothing. I told myself I was being loyal. I told myself I was protecting the family. I was a coward. That is the only honest word for what I was." Elias placed the photograph carefully in the inside pocket of his coat. He did not speak. He did not offer forgiveness or condemnation. He simply looked at Margaret for a long moment, his mother's eyes meeting hers, and then he turned and walked out of the room. The legal proceeding that followed was brief and, from Elias's perspective, largely symbolic. The Beaufort County Probate Court, convened by Judge Hiram Bledsoe's successor, a man named Leland Finch, who was the uncle of the young clerk, Thomas Finch, heard the evidence that Amos Bell had assembled. The bill of sale, the plantation ledger, the copy of Julian's will, the letters to Ruth Carter and Phineas Cross, the testimony of Sarah Pritchard, and the statement that Margaret Weller Ashford had reluctantly agreed to provide. The court found, on January 15th of 1873, that Elias Harrow was the natural son of Julian Weller and Ruth Carter, and that his birth name was Elijah Carter. The finding was entered into the public record, a permanent acknowledgement that could not be erased or obscured, and Elias was issued a certificate of recognition that confirmed his lineage. But the court refused to grant him any claim to Bellwether. The reasoning was technical and, in its own way, as cruel as anything Augustus Weller had done. The will existed only in copy, and without the original, without the final page containing the signatures and the notary's seal, it could not be executed. Furthermore, the laws of South Carolina in 1851 did not recognize the right of an enslaved woman's child to inherit property from a white father, regardless of the father's intentions. The 4 years of war had changed many things, but they had not retroactively altered the legal framework under which the Weller family had operated 2 decades earlier. Elias accepted the ruling without protest. He had not come to Beaufort seeking land or money. He had come seeking a name and a mother and an answer to the question that had haunted him since the moment he opened Nathaniel Harrow's letter in the attic of the house on Pinckney Street. The name had been given to him. The answer, incomplete as it was, had been assembled from fragments of paper and memory and the testimony of an old woman who had carried the truth for 20 years. All that remained was the mother. Before he left Beaufort County, Elias asked to visit the cemetery at Bellwether. The plantation was abandoned now. The great house, a hollow shell with a collapsed roof and walls streaked with mold, the rice fields choked with cattails and wild grass, the live oak still draped in Spanish moss that swayed in the January wind like the hair of drowned women. The entrance road was overgrown, and Elias had to walk the last quarter-mile on foot, following directions provided by a farmer who lived in a cabin near the old property line. The cemetery was located on a low rise behind what had been the main house, surrounded by a wrought iron fence that had rusted through in several places but still stood, barely, as a boundary between the dead and the world that had forgotten them. Inside the fence were a dozen graves, marked by headstones of varying size and ornamentation, the oldest dating to the 1820s and the most recent to 1866. Elias found Julian's grave near the center of the plot. The headstone was simple: Julian Weller, 1824 to 1851, beloved son. No mention of a wife, no mention of children, no Bible verse or poetic epitaph to soften the fact of his death. Just a name, 2 dates, and a lie. Julian had not been a beloved son. He had been a prisoner in his own home, drugged into compliance, robbed of his child and the woman he had loved, and buried at night in a ceremony so furtive that the minister had not even recorded it in the parish register. Beside Julian's grave was the small headstone that Sarah Pritchard had described. It was unmarked, no name, no date, no inscription of any kind, but the date carved into the base was 1866. The headstone was smaller than the others in the plot, barely visible above the grass that had grown around it, as though someone had wanted it to be overlooked. Elias knelt beside the small headstone and placed his hand on the weathered stone. It was cold from the January air, rough under his palm, and it told him nothing. He had no way of knowing whether his mother was buried there or whether the grave belonged to a servant who had died of fever, as Margaret had claimed. The archives contained no record of Ruth Carter's death, no obituary, no burial permit, no mention of her in any public document after the night she had appeared at Bellwether's gate. The uncertainty was the cruelest part. He had come so far, had uncovered so much, and yet the final answer, the place where his mother's body rested, the ground where he might kneel and say the words that had been building in his chest since he first read Nathaniel Harrow's letter, remained hidden. He stayed in the cemetery for an hour until the January sun began to sink toward the tree line and the temperature dropped sharply, as it always did in the low country at dusk. Before he left, he placed the silver medal, the one with the initials J.W., the one his father had given to Nathaniel Harrow as a token of paternal recognition, on the small headstone. It was not the gift that Julian had intended it to be. It was not an inheritance or a legacy or a proof of identity. It was simply an offering, left on a grave that might or might not belong to the woman who had given birth to him, in a cemetery that belonged to a family that had never wanted him to exist. The medal glinted once in the fading light, and then Elias turned and walked back down the overgrown road, away from Bellwether, away from Beaufort County, toward whatever life he would build from the fragments of the one that had been taken from him. The corrected record in the Beaufort County courthouse remained as the only public proof that Ruth Carter had existed, had borne a son, and had been separated from him by a transaction designed not to transfer property, but to erase a family. In the spring of 1874, a retired physician in Charleston, cleaning out his office in preparation for a move to his daughter's home in Savannah, discovered a leather-bound notebook that had belonged to Nathaniel Harrow. The notebook had been among a collection of medical texts that Harrow had donated to the Charleston Medical Society shortly before his death, and it had been shelved without being examined, one volume among hundreds, overlooked for 3 years. The notebook was not a medical journal. It was a personal diary, kept sporadically between 1851 and 1870, and its final entry, written in a hand that had grown shaky with age and illness, contained the words that would eventually find their way to Elias Harrow, who had returned to McClellanville and resumed his father's medical practice under the name Elijah Carter Harrow. The entry read, "Ruth came back. She found me in McClellanville in the summer of 1865 after the war. She had walked from Beaufort County, a distance of 60 miles, and she was thin and ill and did not know who she was speaking to. She told me she was looking for her son, Elijah, who had been taken from Bellwether in the spring of 1851. She said she had been told he was dead, but had never believed it. She said she had been searching for 14 years. When she gave her name, I knew who she was. I did not tell her that I was the one who had taken her son. I did not tell her that Elijah was alive, living in my own house, raised as my own child. I told her I did not know. She left McClellanville the following day. I do not know where she went. I do not know if she is still alive. I have carried this weight for 6 years, and I am writing it now because I cannot carry it any longer. God forgive me." The notebook was sent to Elias by the physician who had found it, a former colleague of Nathaniel Harrow's who had known Elias as a boy and had followed the news of the Beaufort County court case with interest. Elias read the entry in the kitchen of the house on Pinckney Street, standing beside the window that looked out onto the tidal creek behind the property, and when he finished, he closed the notebook and set it on the table and did not open it again. He spent the remaining 28 years of his life as the doctor of McClellanville, a quiet and competent physician who treated the fishermen and their families with the same care that Nathaniel Harrow had shown. He never married, he never had children, he never spoke publicly about Bellwether or the Weller family or the legal proceeding that had restored his name. When asked about his past, he said only that he had been raised by good people and had been fortunate to learn the truth before it was too late. But he never stopped searching for his mother's grave. He wrote letters to every county clerk and church archivist and cemetery caretaker in a 100-mile radius of Beaufort. He visited the property on the western edge of the county where Ruth had been held, a tract of second-growth pine that had changed hands so many times since the war that no one could remember who had owned it in 1852. He interviewed former residents of Bellwether, most of whom were elderly and scattered across the South, and collected fragments of testimony that pointed in a dozen different directions but never converged. The small headstone in the Weller Cemetery remained his only tangible connection, and he returned to it every year in the autumn to clear away the weeds and place a fresh cutting of flowers on the grass. He never knew whether his mother was buried there. He never knew whether she had died of illness on the road, or drowned in the Combahee River, or simply found a new life somewhere far from Beaufort County, with a new name and a new family, too scarred by the past to ever look back. The uncertainty was his inheritance. It was all that Augustus Weller had left him. Not land, not money, not the acknowledgement of a father's bloodline, but the permanent, unanswerable question of where his mother had gone and what had become of her when the truth was too painful to bear. The corrected record in the Beaufort County Courthouse still exists. It is filed in volume 14 of the probate registry on a page that was added after the original volume had been bound, and it reads, Elijah Carter, born November 1850 to Ruth Carter and Julian Weller, recognized by order of the court on January 15, 1873. The ink has faded over the years, and the paper has yellowed, but the words remain legible, a permanent counter-testimony to the bill of sale that had tried and failed to erase them. Amos Bell died in 1891, at the age of 72, still working in the courthouse basement. Among his personal effects, discovered by his daughter after his death, was a small envelope containing a copy of the bill of sale, a transcript of Sarah Pritchard's testimony, and a note written in Amos's hand that read, "The truth is not a weapon, it is a door. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again." Elias Carter Harrow died in March of 1902 at the age of 51 from a fever contracted while treating a patient during an outbreak of malaria in the coastal communities north of Charleston. He was buried in the cemetery of the McClellanville Presbyterian Church beneath a headstone that bore his full name, his medical title, and the dates of his birth and death. At his request, the words "Son of Ruth" were carved at the bottom of the stone, beneath everything else, where the grass would eventually grow up to cover them. The Weller Cemetery at Bellwether was abandoned after Margaret's death in 1884 and has since been reclaimed by the forest. The wrought iron fence has collapsed entirely. The headstones are buried under a century of fallen leaves and pine needles. The grave of Julian Weller and the small headstone beside it are no longer distinguishable from the ground around them. But the silver medal that Elias left on the headstone in 1873, the one engraved with the initials J.W. and the date of his own sale, was discovered by a surveyor in 1962, nearly 90 years later, half buried in the soil of the cemetery plot. The surveyor, a man named Howard Keene, assumed it was a piece of jewelry that had fallen from a visitor's pocket and turned it over to the Beaufort County Historical Society, where it was catalogued and stored in a box of miscellaneous artifacts, its significance unknown and unrecognized. It remains there today, filed and forgotten, a small silver object in a box of small silver objects, waiting for someone who knows what it means.